Hello again, I'm Joan Landis. So right now I want to talk to you a little bit about the importance of understanding trauma. Okay, now trauma is a subject and research in psychology that has not really gotten out into the mainstream like we would like it to. A lot of times the last thing people know about psychology is something they learned in high school psychology that has to do with rewards and reinforcement schedules, B.F. Skinner and his rats and his pigeons. Okay, and so they think that everyone can be manipulated through reinforcements and a schedule of reinforcements. Well, that's not entirely true. When people have been traumatized, especially if they felt alone in that trauma, it actually tends to shift responses in the brain, and those trauma memories are stored in a part of the brain with long-term memory, and it actually changes their perception of risk, their perception of ability to trust, and changes how the world occurs for them, because the world looks much more dangerous and it feels much more dangerous, okay? It's not a totally prefrontal cortex cognitive process. If you think about it, trauma memories and trauma experiences, think of, in mammals, they can be traumatized, and what happens when they're traumatized? They remember it forever. Okay, so if you get a horse that's been traumatized on a trail, a lion or a pheasant jumped out, for the next 20 years, every time that horse goes on that trail right there, they will have a trauma response. They'll start shaking, they'll shy, they'll throw up their head, they'll stop, they'll maybe bolt. And that's simply a mammalian way of lowering the risk for the next time. Something about that experience frightened them on such a deep survival level that the mammalian part of the brain said, whoa, we better never forget what happened there, because next time you might not survive. So you'd better be hyper vigilant about anything that looks like that again. So the interesting thing is that as humans, yes, we have a much more developed neocortex. That's all of the new brain that's on the top of that mammalian brain, but we still have all of those more primitive response capacities. And when we are traumatized, we have many of the same responses that other mammals do when they've been traumatized. What happens then is that instead of using logic and our problem solving and prefrontal cortex in order to think things through in the healthiest ways, that the trauma reaction will often kick in when things look risky, and we respond in ways that really don't look logical, that don't serve us well, especially in this society. We end up fighting, running, shutting down, those kind of things, and having intense physical responses, and that we can't necessarily control. Well, the interesting thing is that the research on trauma and its effects really hasn't disseminated into the modern understanding, except for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? So a lot of people kind of understand that on a general basis, but trauma can happen to anybody, and it's very relative. What traumatizes one person might not traumatize another. And it sets us up for anxiety, depression, addictions, acting out, just ways to try to deal or cope with it that involves shutting down or acting out. And so the people around us and we ourselves need to understand how this works and how it affects our lives, so that we have more compassion and less judgment and condemnation and hopelessness and dealing with it in non-beneficial ways. So the typical trauma is things like war, or first responders, or natural disasters, Those all can be traumatic. But smaller things can be traumatic too, especially to children. Children are very small. They're very cognizant of their vulnerability. And things seem much bigger and much more dangerous to them than to us. And so when children, something happens to a child, and they will carry those trauma wounds often for the rest of their life. And then they will have anxiety, depression, or acting out responses, or self-medication through addiction for any kind of stress that seems to trigger those feelings, those same feelings. And so for children, the trauma, a divorce can be very traumatic to children. A death of a loved one, very traumatic. A death of a pet, a sustained family illness, unemployment, conflict in marriages, a school that feels unsafe or dangerous, a neighborhood that feels unsafe or dangerous, not getting enough to eat, and just things like that. Even things like too much daycare can actually be quite traumatizing to some children. And so as parents, our goal is to protect children from major sources of trauma and to offer tons and tons of social support whenever they have been traumatized. Other ways that children get traumatized are bullying, for sure. That can be extremely traumatic if it's not handled in empowering ways. So just be mindful of if you may have encountered trauma in your life. It's interesting because there's two classic responses in child raising to that. Either you actually don't protect your child enough, your boundaries are pretty porous, and you're like, yeah, why not have, the high school kid that got kicked out from his house, he can come stay here for, 3 months, and I've got this little daughter that likes to cuddle with him. Okay, what's wrong with this picture, right? But a lot of people who have been traumatized in their relationships, they have very poor relationship boundaries, and they don't understand how risky those things can be to perpetuate trauma in the next generation. And that's one way that trauma gets perpetuated from generation to generation, is that the parents simply don't protect their children like regular untraumatized parents would do. The other flip side of the coin is they become hypervigilant to everything and overprotective, and everything looks like a risk, and everything looks like a possible trauma. And so that's really not good for kids either. That makes them really anxious and clingy and dependent on, that kind of feeling with mom or dad until they finally get sick of it. And then, boy, I'll tell you, the breakout from that can be dramatic. You get a teenager that is tired of being over-sheltered and overprotected, and they're going to go out of there, and it's pretty explosive. So the results of trauma for that next generation can be really damaging. So if you feel like, wow, I'm having these big responses to things that shouldn't be that big of a deal, you may have something in your background that traumatized you that really didn't heal well. And if so, there's things that you can do. You can definitely get on my course about trauma and find out ways to process that, heal that, move on, and turn post-traumatic stress into post-traumatic growth. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful to you to have a little more compassion on people who are struggling because maybe they have been traumatized and they have big emotional reactions that are a little bit out of their control. So, okay, I hope that you can be more understanding parent and sibling and neighbor and also more understanding of yourself. See ya, bye.